Good morning. We're back for another episode of reading the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice, approximately 10 minutes a day. And today is August 19th of 2021, and we're reading out of Chapter 21, John Hasnas, The Myth of the Rule of Law in 1995. And we're going to continue toward the top of page 341. So we're just going to go ahead and start reading. Here we go. So what would a free market in legal services, I'm sorry, I got to get a little sip of coffee here. So what would a free market in legal services be like? As Sherlock Holmes would regularly say to the good doctor, quote, "You see, Watson, but you do not observe." Examples of non-state law are all around us. Consider labor management collective bargaining agreements. In addition to setting wage rates, such agreements typically determine both the work rules the parties must abide by and the grievance procedures they must follow to resolve disputes. In essence, such contracts create the substantive law of the workplace, as well as the workplace judiciary. A similar situation exists with regard to homeowner agreements, which create both the rules and dispute settlement procedures within a condominium or housing development, i.e., the law and judicial procedures of the residential community. Perhaps a better example is supplied by universities. These institutions create their own codes of conduct for both students and faculty that cover everything from academic dishonesty to what constitutes acceptable speech and dating behavior. In addition, they not only devise their own elaborate judicial procedures to deal with violations of these codes, but typically supply their own campus police forces as well. A fine example may be supplied by the many commercial enterprises that voluntarily opt out of the state judicial system by writing clauses in their contracts that require disputes to be settled through binding arbitration or mediation rather than through a lawsuit. In this vein, the variegated, quote, legal procedures that have recently been assigned the sobriquet of Alternative Dispute Resolution, ADR, do a good job of suggesting what a free market in legal services might look like. Of course, it is not merely that we fail to observe what is presently all around us. We also act as though we have no knowledge of our own cultural or legal history. Consider, for example, the situation of African American communities in the segregated South or the immigrant communities in New York in the first quarter of the 20th century. Because of prejudice, poverty, and the language barrier, these groups were essentially cut off from the state legal system. And yet, rather than disintegrate into chaotic disorder, they were able to privately supply themselves with the rules of behavior and dispute settlement procedures necessary to maintain peaceful, stable, and highly structured communities. Furthermor, virtually none of the law that orders our interpersonal relationships was produced by the intentional actions of central governments. Our commercial law arose almost entirely from the law merchant, a non-governmental set of rules and procedures developed by merchants to quickly and peacefully resolve disputes and facilitate commercial relations. Property, tort, and criminal law are all the products of common law process by which rules of behavior evolve out of and are informed by the particular circumstances of actual human controversies. In fact, a careful study of Anglo-American legal history will demonstrate that almost all of the law which facilitates peaceful human interaction arose in this way. On the other hand, the source of the law which produces oppression and social division is almost always the state. Measures that impose religious or racial intolerance, economic exploitation, one group's idea of, quote, fairness, or another's of, quote, community, or, quote, family values, virtually always originate in legislation, the law consciously made by the central government. If the purpose of the law really is to bring order to human existence, then it is fair to say that the law actually made by the state is precisely the law that does not work. Unfortunately, no matter how suggestive these examples might be, They represent only what can develop within a state-dominated system. Since, for the reasons indicated above, it is impossible to outthink a free market. Any attempt to account for what would result from a true free market in law would be pure speculation. However, if I must engage in such speculation, I will try to avoid what might be called, quote, static thinking in doing so. Static thinking occurs when we imagine changing one feature of a dynamic system without appreciating how doing so will alter the character of all other features of the system. For example, I would be engaging in static thinking were I to ask how, if the state did not provide the law and courts, the free market could provide them in their present form. It is this type of thinking that is responsible for the conventional assumption that free market legal services would be, quote, competing governments, which would be the equivalent of organized gang warfare. Once this static thinking is rejected, it becomes apparent that if the state did not provide the law and the courts, they simply would not exist in their present form. This, however, only highlights the difficulty of describing free market order-generating services and reinforces the speculative nature of all attempts to do so. One thing it seems safe to assume is that there would not be any universally binding society-wide set of, quote, legal rules. In a free market, the law would not come in one size fits all. Although the rules necessary to the maintenance of a minimal level of order, such as prohibitions against murder, assault, and theft, would be common to most systems, different communities of interest would assuredly adopt those rules and dispute settlement procedures that would best fit their needs. For example, it seems extremely unlikely that there would be anything resembling a uniform body of contract law. Consider as just one illustration the differences between commercial and consumer contracts. Commercial contracts are usually between corporate entities with specialized knowledge of industrial practices and a financial interest in minimizing the interruption of business. On the other hand, consumer contracts are those in which one or both parties lack commercial sophistication and large sums do not rest upon a speedy resolution of any dispute that might arise. In a free market for legal services, the rules that govern these types of contracts would necessarily be radically different. This example can also illustrate the different types of dispute settlement procedures that would be likely to arise. In disputes over consumer contracts, the parties might well be satisfied with the current system of litigation, in which the parties present their cases to an impartial judge or jury who renders a verdict for one side or the other. However, in commercial disputes, the parties might prefer a mediational process with a negotiated settlement in order to preserve an ongoing commercial relationship, or a quick and informal arbitration in order to avoid the losses associated with excessive delay. Further, it is virtually certain that they would want mediators, arbitrators, or judges who were highly knowledgeable about commercial practice, rather than a typical generalist judge or a jury of laypeople. The problem with trying to specify the individualized, quote, legal systems which would develop is that there is no limit to the number of dimensions along which individuals may choose to order their lives, and hence no limit to the number of overlapping sets of rules and dispute resolution procedures to which they may subscribe. An individual might settle his or her disputes with neighbors according to voluntarily adopted homeowner association rules and procedures. With coworkers according to the rules and procedures described in a collective bargaining agreement, with members of his or her religious congregation according to scriptural law and tribunal, with other drivers according to the process agreed to in his or her automobile insurance contract, and with total strangers by selecting a dispute resolution company from the yellow pages of the phone book. Given the current thinking about racial and sexual identity, it seems likely that many disputes among members of the same minority group or among women would be brought to, quote, niche dispute resolution companies composed predominantly of members of the relevant group, who would use their specialized knowledge of the group culture to devise superior rules and procedures for intragroup dispute resolution. I suspect that in many ways a free market in law would resemble the situation in medieval Europe before the rise of strong central governments, in which disputants could select among several fora. Depending upon the nature of the dispute, its geographical location, the party's status, and what was convenient, the parties could bring their case in either village, shire, urban, merchant, manorial, ecclesiastical, or royal courts. Even with the limited mobility and communications of the time, this restricted market for dispute settlement services was able to generate the order necessary for both the commercial and civil advancement of society. Consider how much more effectively such a market could function given the current level of travel and telecommunication technology. Under contemporary conditions, there would be an explosion of alternative order-providing organizations. I would expect that late at night, wedged between commercials for Vegematic and Slim Whitman albums, we would find television ads with messages such as, quote, upset with your neighbor for playing rock and roll music all night long? Is his dog digging up your flower beds? Come to Acme Arbitration Company's grand opening 2-for-1 sale. I should point out that despite my earlier disclaimer, even these suggestions embody static thinking, since they assume that a free market would produce a choice among confrontational systems of justice similar to the one we are most familiar with. In fact, I strongly believe that this would not be the case. The current state-supplied legal system is adversarial in nature, pitting the plaintiff or prosecution against the defendant in a winner-take-all, loser-gets-nothing contest. The reason for this arrangement has absolutely nothing to do with this procedure's effectiveness in settling disputes and everything to do with the medieval English king's desire to centralize power. For historical reasons well beyond the scope of this article, the crown was able to extend its temporal power relative to the feudal lords, as well as raise significant revenue by commanding or enticing the parties to local disputes to bring their case before the king or other royal official for decision. Our current system of adversarial presentation to a third-party decision-maker is an outgrowth of these early, quote, public choice considerations, not its ability to successfully provide mutually satisfactory resolutions to interpersonal disputes. And we'll wrap up about halfway down through 345, again reading about 10 minutes a day from the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. And we'll be back. We only have a couple more days of reading. Have a good one.